3. October 1988. Funkhaus Nallepastraus, East Berlin. He wrote it in a narrow hand on the thin paper of a state-issue notebook and closed the cover as the red light went on. 1988, East Berlin studio. I tell people what to think. In 1995, I asked them what they think. The microphone stayed the same. The script did not. The sentence would have been unbroadcastable. It summarized a life. It contained a promise he had no right to make at the time. He was a voice on state radio. He read what was put before him. He had learned to survive by speaking what others wrote, and to leave the dangerous sentences in pencil in a book that he kept in a drawer that he locked. He had begun with rubble. 12. May 1945. Köpenick, southeastern Berlin. He was 12. He was called Karl. He did not yet know what his voice would become useful for. He knew where the water pump was on the street. He knew which walls were stable enough to climb. He knew that in the mornings the women came with hammers and shoulder scarves, and that the men moved slower when they showed themselves at all. The word in the block was Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. It was a term that sounded like a medal. It hid the mathematics. Each cubic meter of brick weighed over a ton. Each storied house collapsed into something like geology. In Karl's backyard, a new hill of crushed mortar rose as the bricks were knocked loose and stacked in careful lines to be cleaned. Times were measured by the length of a trench of bricks cleaned on an entry step. Calories were counted against hours. 1,500 calories for a labourer, 1,000 for a clerk. In the British reports, the numbers are neat. In the kitchen, they were hunger. He wrote about them later when he knew what to call them. The women were between 20 and 50. The older ones carried themselves like sleigh horses. The younger ones did not speak. They had reasons to carry iron bars. The Soviet officers came through the courtyards. There were curfews posted in Russian and German. There were whistles and orders. The fear in those first days was shapeless. It had a uniform. It had no name. It showed up where the food had been and where the men were missing. Karl's father had been a clerk in the Reichsbahn. He had been a party member because most men in his office were. He had not been home since January. He might be in a column walking west. He might be in a camp on the Oder. He might be under a pile of bricks on Landsberger Alley. Those were the three categories in the arithmetic of missing family members. In the occupation reports, the phrase is unknown whereabouts. In the letters soldiers sent home, it was lost contact. In the kitchens, it was silence. The Americans were not the ones who came down Karl Street. The Russians were. There were orders to surrender firearms. There were orders to hand in radios. There were orders to hand in radios. There were printed lists on doors noting who lived where. An Allied Control Authority directive pinned to a doorway could end a store. A knock could begin an interrogation. The Allies brought order, and their order began with the arithmetic of control: curfew at 9, lights out, no gatherings, ration cards required for bread. Ration cards made paper more valuable than coins. There is a file in Bundesarchiv, a municipal rationing manual, May 1945. It shows bread allocations in grams per person per day, by category: heavy labourer, normal worker, dependent, child. It is not a sentimental document, it is a table. The tables created appetites. He learned the marketplaces. He learned the corners where men with short hair and quick hands preferred to stand. He learned that cigarettes were a currency that did not spoil. Work paid in calories, risk paid in cigarettes. The black market was not an underground city. It stood in daylight in Alexanderplatz and in the ruins near Anhalter Bahnhof. The US military government, in its intelligence summaries, makes it sound like a criminal enterprise centered in a few rough hands. The files exaggerate the role of gangs and underplay the mathematics of hunger. In Karl's memory, the black market looked like a lot of people hungry at the same time and none of them wanting to die waiting. He wrote later, 13 June 1945, "Mother traded her last wedding silver for 2 cartons of Chesterfields. We ate the wrappers." The line is theatrical. The wrappers were not edible. His mother was not comedic. But the memory is exact. Chesterfields could buy bacon fat and 2 potatoes. The arithmetic was cruel and transparent. 10 cigarettes for a lump of fat, 4 for a half loaf. In the winter of 1946-47, the hunger winter, the numbers shifted and the conversation stopped. He was 15 then. He remembers the way the air bit inside his lungs. There are films that show those streets in muted grey. The government reports show degrees. Celsius continued below 0 into February. Schools shortened. Streetcars ran less often. Children fainted in class. Mothers cut bread in slices thin enough to see through. In the Soviet files, numbers were reported upward. In house diaries, lines broke off. 24. February 1947. No fuel. Slept with coats. No news of Hans. The boy did not get up. Said his legs hurt. It was his mother's hand. The legs hurt because they were hungry. The men with armbands began to ask questions that had not been asked in public before. The denazification. The word was thick in his mouth when he said it. The Americans had their forms. The British had their panels. The French had lists. The Soviets had committees and a clear sense of who should lose a farm. The questionnaires were not all the same, but they asked the same questions. Were you a member of the NSDAP? When? What rank? What did you do at work? What did you know? Did you employ forced laborers? Did you denounce anyone? Name 3 witnesses from your neighborhood who can attest to your political reliability. In the American zone, they called them Spruchkammern. There were categories printed on stamped paper with German words in old fonts: Hauptschuldig, Belastet, Minder Belastet, Mitläufer, Entlastet. Major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. The classification generated a new arithmetic of guilt. A major offender could lose property and freedom. A follower could pay a fine and return to a desk if someone in his street still liked him enough to sign a Perselschein, an affidavit of cleanliness named with black humor after the brand of washing powder. Berlin was unique and not. It was divided into sectors and governed by committees that did not trust one another. The denazification files for the city of Berlin are a math problem done in pencil and then erased. Karl's father, when he came home in October 1946 with a cough that shook him, filled out Form E1 in triplicate in the office of the Soviet city commandant. He listed his party membership. He wrote that he had joined in 1937 for professional reasons. He wrote that he had signed no denunciations. He wrote that he had always had doubts. He found 2 men on the street who would sign that he had helped them find work. He waited in a hallway with a broken window for 3 hours. He was told to come back next week. In the case file, the handwriting is his, and there is a stamp. He was classified as Mitläufer, a follower. He paid a fine. He was assigned to clean the tracks and then allowed to return to an office when a younger man from the anti-fascist bloc committee decided that the trains needed someone who could read the schedules. The system needed stability more than it needed purity. The mathematics of rail cars outweighed the mathematics of guilt. The Allied policy had been thorough, on paper. The post-war economy was thin on people who had not held a stamp and a pen between 1933 and 1945. A punishment policy turned into a bargaining card. It was administratively elegant and morally compromised. There are interrogation transcripts in Allied intelligence summaries where men repeat certain lines. Ich war nur dabei. I was only there. Ich habe befohlen und gehorcht. I gave orders and obeyed orders. The sentences were protective. The logic was circular. They were accepted more often than not because they were persuasive, because the arithmetic of keeping the lights on favored the men who had once turned them on. The American zones printed schoolbooks that cut new lines in old paragraphs. The pages spoke of a small clique. They spoke of seduction and a nation led astray. They spoke of suffering in air raids. They were not lies. They were not complete. The Soviet zone did something else. It wrote that fascism was a form of monopoly capitalism and that the people had been betrayed by capitalists. The anti-fascist resistance was praised in pages and walls. It was correct in parts. It was a clean story. It contained few names that lived down the block. Karl sat in classrooms that winter with his cap on. His teacher had been away for a while and then was back. The new words were awkward in her mouth, but she spoke them. She spoke about the anti-fascist struggle and the rebuilt schools. She did not speak about the men with red bands who came at night. She did not speak about the woman in the back row who had missed a month of class because her husband had come back and went to bed and did not get up again. The arithmetic of lessons was clear. History is a ladder out of the present, if you keep climbing the right rungs and do not look sideways. Into their courtyards came new Germans. From Königsberg, from Silesia, from the Sudetenland. They came with carts and drag ropes and swollen feet. They came with nothing. The numbers were enormous. The Bundesarchiv figures, repeated in every history, are abstract. 12 million. 14, depending on how you count. In Karl's courtyard, the numbers were 4. A mother and her 2 boys and a grandfather. They slept under a tarpaulin in the basement because the uncle on the 2nd floor had 2 rooms and would not give one. Die Expulsion, Vertreibung, was a word with politics in it. It was also a thing that happened to a lot of people, very quickly, with very little to eat. The arriving ones demanded what the present ones did not have. The arithmetic of rooms was cold. A notary came and wrote down the square meters. He divided by the number of heads. He wrote the number on a paper and pinned it near the door. Karl watched the new boys fight in the courtyard for a corner. He swapped his half of a ration card for a story about Elbing. The grandfather had a voice that sounded like a gramophone worn down. He spoke as if he had been to nowhere and everywhere. He spoke about the road to the west. He spoke about bodies in ditches. He did not call them Germans or Poles. He called them bodies. There were displaced persons in their city. Jews who were alive. Ukrainians who did not want to go back. French and Dutch who would go tomorrow if the train came. A DP camp had been set up in the school where Karl's cousin should have started 1st grade. Allied occupation reports described these camps in the professional tone of men writing to other men far away. They are precise about latrines and lice. They are less precise about the way the German streets near the fences talked. They get more food. They are dangerous. They should be moved. It is not elegant to write these sentences now, but they were spoken. They are recorded in police logs and block committee minutes. They belong to the arithmetic of envy and the politics of denial. Karl stood near a fence once and listened to singing. It was late summer. The air smelled like dust. He did not understand the words. He did not forget the tune. He saw a woman with a star on her coat, not because she had to, but because she did. She looked at him without interest. He felt, for years, that the look had judged him and found him exactly as he was, a boy who had eaten a piece of black market sausage paid for with a cigarette, while men with pins on their lapels asked him to fetch water. There are files, collected later, that say the German population near DP camps had to be confronted with films and photographs. The Allies marched them past open pits. They showed them piles of shoes. There are photographs of German faces looking at German faces. The faces do not speak. The captions speak for them. A dangerous habit of history. In Carl Street, the confrontation happened differently. It came in bits. A rumor, a returning man whose shirt smelled like a factory floor and who did not speak for a week. A photograph in a cousin's drawer of a woman who did not come back. Silence is not a moral position. It is a resource. It was used. He was 16 when he went to the radio station the first time. It was 1949. Berlin was already a map with colors. The blockade had turned the sky into a system. The airlift planes came over the roofs in steady files. Their mathematics were precise. Tonnage, altitude, frequency, landing time, loading time, fuel. It was war without shooting. It was logistics as politics. In the files of the US Air Force, it is an achievement. In Carl's ears, it was mercy and annoyance in one. It made a particular sound that his voice would one day imitate on the air when he wanted to sound neutral. He had no job. He had a voice. He went to the building on Funkhaus Nalapastra because a friend said they were hiring runners. He carried paper from room to room. He learned that a voice and a sentence can mean something and its opposite, depending on where the comma is placed. He learned that men in plain suits had opinions about commas. He learned that words like peace and solidarity and reconstruction are like bread, necessary, subject to mold, and bearing odors of the place where they are baked. The documents for 1950 are clear. The German Democratic Republic existed, at least on paper. It was anti-fascist. It was the future. It was a place where men like his father could go to the office in a clean jacket and not be asked what they had done, if they agreed to believe certain sentences now. It was a place where men who had done terrible things, if they did not cross the wrong men, could also go to work, and where men who had done nothing but been born to a particular household were sent to the countryside to dig beets. The mathematics of guilt and the mathematics of utility intersected and produced a function called normalcy. He began to read copy in 1954. 2 pages, typed, double-spaced, carbon smudges on the backs. The manual, a bound book kept in a grey drawer, said, Sprache ruhig, verbindlich, deutlich. Adjective sparen. Calm, binding, clear. Spare adjectives. He liked the technical terms. He liked the microphone. He liked the way a red light concentrated the room into a human throat. He liked the way an engineer said 18 seconds and waved 2 fingers and the way his mouth obeyed. There is a list of program titles in the archive. Evening Report, Worker's Voice, Our Youth Talks. The tongue had a habit. It curled into a certain rhythm. The phrases were not lies. They were not always true. They were shapes of consent. He had learned that shape at a time when mothers took hammers to bricks. He had learned that not every true thing is helpful when there is not enough bread. He spoke sentences that were intended to give shape to the day. He thought sometimes about the fence and the song. He did not speak about that. He married in 1957. He moved into a room with a sofa that became a bed. He had to show his passport to a man who wore a leather jacket indoors. He had to fill out forms to get a telephone. He was awarded a membership in the Journalists' Union. He gave blood when asked. It was a state. It raised monuments. The schoolbook in his daughter's hand had a full page on Ernst Thälmann and a paragraph on 1938 that began, Die Nazi-Führer im Dienst der Monopole. The brevity had a purpose. It supported the narrative that guilt lay over there in the class of people they did not know, and that their suffering in 1945 had burned away their complicity. It made life easier. It also left a rot in certain rooms. In 1961, the war rose. He did not go to work for 3 days. He stayed home and listened to the radio. He turned the knobs and listened to Rias and to the domestic channel. He listened to his colleagues. He listened to their voices. He did not listen to their words. He wrote in his notebook. He kept one by then. All the sentences are short. The hands are heavy. In the afternoon, I read a page about peace. It landed in pieces. The radio historians write about that day as a victory of organization. The mathematics were crisp. Meters of barbed wire per minute. Truckloads of concrete. Units deployed per street. It was administration as a kind of polite siege. It made people into variables. He spoke on the radio about economic plans and harvests and the youth brigades. He believed in some of it. He believed in order. He remembered the hunger winter. He did arithmetic on ration cards and decided that lines are better than fights. He believed that the past had been a kind of disease and that the new doctors were at least washing their hands. He did not ask about the men whose photographs were not pinned on walls anymore. In 1968, he covered a conference on anti-fascism. He read names of resistance fighters with the respect of a man reading names of family. He drank schnapps with an older man from the provinces who told him a story about a list that had been typed wrong when it went from one office to another. He did not write down the story. There are stories that cannot be documented even when they are true. They live in the space where mathematics fails. He watched the West on television. The sets were expensive, but not scarce. He saw advertisements. He heard that men called managers apologized to the public for things. He heard that other men argued with them on the air. He did not think it was freedom when he was 35. He thought it was noise. When he was 45, he thought it was a kind of weather that people got used to, like rain. He did not imagine that he would stand in the same weather one day and ask questions. He did not ask many questions in 1977. He read the news about a hijacked Lufthansa jet in a tone of controlled gravity. He knew from instructions that terror was a word with 2 syllables. He pronounced it carefully. He had colleagues who drank too much. He had an uncle who died at 60 without ever speaking about a certain house on a certain street in 1942. He organized a report on a new housing block and took a photograph of children sliding on a railing. He liked the photograph. It had the kind of future in it that planners like to see. He felt the edges of something else. He kept notebooks. He wrote dates and times and thoughts. He wrote a sentence in 1983 that made him stop writing for a week. When the old women talk in the stairwell about 1945, it is not about the Jews. It is about how long it took the water to come back on. He underlined the words and put the book away. He spent an hour that day in an archive reading the transcript of a Spruchkammer hearing from 1947 in the American sector. A man named Heinrich S. from Reinickendorf. The categories were clear. The questions were formal. The statements were almost musical in their repetition. I was not politically active. I had to feed a family. The panel classified him as minder belastete, lesser offender. He was fined. He went back to work as a section head in 1950. His signature appears on a personnel file for a man who would later become a minister. The mathematics are plain. The system reused its parts. In the 1980s, he read letters from listeners on Friday mornings in a segment called Post aus der Republik. The letters were typed. The letters were in pencil. The letters used the same 20 adjectives: diligent, exemplary, constructive, brave, vigilant. Sometimes there was a sentence that did not seem to come from the list. My father says there was a neighbor with a brown coat who walked faster when he saw our window. He read some sentences and discarded some. There is a politics to reading letters on the air. There is an arithmetic to selection. He did not always like the numbers. 1988. He wrote and tucked that dangerous sentence into his desk. He had begun to feel that the floor under him could move. He was 55. He had watched men his age begin to talk about 30 years ago after a third glass. He had looked at the biographies printed in the back of books and seen how the early pages were thinner. He had stood at a microphone for 30 years and told people what the plan was for tomorrow. He began to suspect that the plan was about to collapse, not from a blow, but from a decrease in interest. Then it collapsed. Not evenly, not elegantly, not to a plan. The border guards stood and could not decide whether to shoot. They did not. The streets filled. The radio stations did not know whether to play music or be silent. He stood at his microphone and read a bulletin that had itself been written with hands shaking. He remembers the sentence, Die Grenze ist offen. The border is open. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He went home and cried in his kitchen. He did not have a plan for the morning. 1990 was improvisation as policy. The mathematics were huge and vulgar. Currency conversion at 2-to-1 for ordinary savings, at 1-to-1 for wages. The numbers had a morality in them. They punished saving and rewarded speed. They were necessary. They were unjust. He learned the word Treuhand as if it were a person. It was a vehicle for transferring property and hope. It closed factories. It opened stores. It opened highways. It closed lives. He lost his job in 1990 in a manner that felt like mercy. The station was merged, demerged, renamed. He was offered a bridge, demerged, renamed. He was offered a bridge to a different. In the West, stations had more light in the hallways, and the engineers made jokes that had brands in them. He learned to wait for a caller. He learned to ask, "What do you think?" The first time he said it, he felt like a man speaking a sentence he had been trying to say for decades. He had a talent for listening to an answer he did not like, and then asking another question that did not show dislike. He did not use many adjectives. He had learned to spare them. He sat in Cologne in 1995. WDR, Gebäude am Wallrafplatz. The studio smelled like new plastic and coffee. The microphone was a better model, but the shape was the same, a human mouth and a circle that turns breath into signal. He took calls from men who talked about pensions and from women who talked about neighbors, and from young people who talked about the word Wende, as if it had happened to someone else. He asked a question about 1945 on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first caller told him about a photograph in a drawer. He asked another question on Thursday about expellees, and the third caller said a word his daughter said he was not allowed to say. He let the word hang, then said, "We do not say that here," and moved on. He had not escaped his past. He had moved it to a different program. He thought often about 1945. He thought about the women with hammers. He thought about his father's form. He thought about the boys from Königsberg who had to sleep in the basement. He thought about the DP camp and the song. He thought about the time he read a report in a Bundesarchiv file labeled B16227779, a selection of Allied interrogation reports where a man from Siemens described how he requisitioned labor in 1943 and how he still ran a department in 1952. He thought about the mathematics of guilt, which is never solved with a single equation and often solved by forgetting the variables you cannot afford to consider. He collected testimonies, not professionally, for himself. He wrote lines down when someone in a stairwell said something that did not fit. He took notes when a neighbor mentioned that his father had been in the SA and then laughed and exhaled in a way that made the laughter solicit pity. He filed the notes in a shoebox. He did not intend to write a book. He intended to keep a map of a country that he recognized and that did not show up in tourist brochures. Meanwhile, the economy rearranged itself. He walked through city centers that had been rebuilt more times than a childhood can hold. In 1949, the shop windows had been empty. In 1959, they had been careful. In 1969, in his part of town, they had been uniform. In 1999, they were full, and sameness had been replaced by multiplicity, each item arriving in a ship with a flag on its stern. Load lists replaced ration cards. The mathematics of plenty demanded new skills, choosing, discarding, the moral act of paying at a register for goods made by hands he would never see. He visited Magdeburg in 1997 and stood in front of a building that had been a youth club and had once been a party office, and before that had been a small synagogue. He read a plaque. It said nothing about who paid for stones in 1890, and everything about stones broken in 1938. The commemoration was sincere. It was late. Schoolchildren came with candles. He watched an elderly man look at the candles and then away. He thought, as he often did, that there is no sentence that starts with "we" that holds steady for more than 10 years. He read his daughter's school books. The pages on the Third Reich were thicker than his had been. The photographs were not blurrier. The paragraphs mentioned perpetrators by name. The pages on expulsions were also thick. They had statistics in boxes. They did not have the smell of a basement where a grandfather told stories with no names. He was glad. He was dissatisfied. He was an old man who had learned that history is always either too much or not enough. He hosted a talk show about memory. He invited a historian from Munich who wrote about denazification. The historian said numbers like a litany. 3.6 million in the American zone processed. 2.1 million classified as Mittelwerfer. 46,000 classified as Belastet. 486 as Hauptschuldig convicted. The numbers sounded to Karl like receipts. They did not smell like kitchens. He looked at the guest and said, "When my father came home, he went to an office and filled out a form, and a man in a uniform told him to come back next week. He went back, and a man in a different uniform told him to pay 50 marks and go clean the railway tracks. He did, and 2 months later he was back at a desk with a hinge on it. He died in 1963. He did not pay again." The historian nodded. He said, "The system needed administrators." He said, "The good men were scarce." He said, "The mathematics of reconstruction are brutal." He said, "What matters is what we do with the knowledge now." Karl nodded and asked for calls. He listened to a woman whose father had been in the Wehrmacht in the East and came back with a cough and nightmares. He listened to a man whose grandparents had come from Breslau and who could not say the new name of the city without swallowing a bitterness that had been made in other kitchens. He listened to a survivor who had lived in a DP camp in the British zone and who said that the German children looked at them through the fence as if they were animals, and that she never forgave them, and that she sometimes forgives him, the man on the radio, because he sounds like he knows. He did know some things. He knew how to read a file. He knew how to keep his breath even when someone admitted something it would be easier to forget. He knew that the voice he had learned in the 1950s to read about grain harvests could be used to read names of dead neighbors. He knew that the sound of a train from 1949 sliding into Tempelhof with flour on board could be heard in 1995 in the click of a phone line when someone in a village near Magdeburg finally said the name of the woman they had not said in 50 years. He did not absolve. He did not accuse. He was not a judge. He was a man with a microphone and a set of memories. He had learned that the front line after 1945 did not run between armies but among families. It ran in the way a husband and a wife talked about a uniform hanging in a wardrobe. It ran through denazification files that classified men into categories that were generous to the system and harsh to the individual child who would later ask questions. It ran through the lists of expellees that allocated mattresses in school gymnasiums and did not allocate pity. It ran through the fences of DP camps where "we" lost its meaning and "I" had to bear a weight that a pronoun cannot carry. He went back to Köpenick in 2001. The pump on the street had been removed long ago. The courtyard had a small tree. The rubble had been folded into foundations and sidewalks. He stood where his mother had cut thin bread and where the grandfather from Elbing had told him about a road. He had a notebook in his pocket. He still wrote in pencil. He wrote, "We needed bread. We needed order. We needed order. We needed to forget. We needed to remember." The mathematics were impossible. He put the book away. He spoke to school groups sometimes. He did not bring a lecture. He brought stories. He told them about Chesterfields. He told them about the first day the light came back on in their stairwell. He told them about his first time in a studio. He kept the tone cool. He used short sentences when the air got warm. He said, "I learned to let a silence stand." He said, "I learned to ask a silence stand." He said, "I learned to ask a second question." He knew a man who had been a policeman in 1939 and in 1946 and in 1992. He asked him over coffee how he counted his days. The man said, "I counted my days by the weight of the belt I wore." He wrote the line down and thought it should be in a book. It is not in a book. It is here. He had a shelf with documents. A letter from his father, written with a pencil end on a card in 1946 from a camp near the Oder. "I am here. Do not sell the coat. Is the boy well?" A copy of a Spruchkammer form he had found in an archive after filing a request and waiting 2 weeks. A copy of an Allied intelligence summary on black market prices in the American sector, 1946. A set of photographs of the DP camp in Mariendorf, taken by a soldier with an eye for both wire and faces. A municipal housing allocation sheet from 1947 that assigned a widow and 2 daughters to half a room in an apartment on the 3rd floor. A clipping from 1950 of a column called "From the Reconstruction Front." A broadcasting manual from 1954. A WDR program schedule from 1995 with his name in a box at 22. He looked at the shelf sometimes and thought of it as a cross-section of his country. He did not forget the hunger winters. He met a young man born in 1987 who had never been hungry. He envied him. He did not envy him. He thought of what hunger had given him, a respect for bread, an understanding of ration cards as moral documents, a suspicion of easy narratives that excuse entire classes of people, a caution around adjectives. He did not become a hero of remembrance. He did not stand in front of rallies and raise a fist. He sat at a table and kept his voice steady. He took calls. He edited, not by cutting truth, but by cutting heat. It is a skill you can learn from men who once cut coal in basements. It is a way of living with contradictions without making them into decorations. He thought often of the mathematics of reparations. He read news about payments to survivors and to states. He read about pensions for former civil servants with clean records. He read about the cost of reconstruction and the cost of memory. He made little lists in the margins of newspapers, numbers, sums, the ways money is a moral argument. He did not resolve the equations. He understood a truth about real lives and systems. They grind together, they crush, they leave sediment. The rubble women did not get monuments at first, then they did. The men with files did not call themselves functionaries, then they did. The children looked at fences, then they voted. He had been a boy and a man and a professional voice. He had been a mouthpiece and a listener. He had navigated an economy of scarcity and an economy of choice. The mathematics changed. The voice did not. On a night in 2005, he closed a program with a sentence that could have gotten him fired in 1988. He said, "We are not clean."